Think of the last time you did something well. I mean, really well. Now be honest about what you did next. Did you sit with that quietly, knowing that it was good? Or did you go looking for someone to validate you? Most of us go looking. We can't help it. Somewhere along the way, we stop being the ones who decide if we're enough and start waiting for a crowd to decide for us. It doesn't happen all at once. We hand away power a little bit at a time to anyone willing to hold the other end of the scale. There was a potter who handed away so slowly he never felt it go. He wasn't rich or poor. He made bowls and cups, plain jars for oil and grain, nothing a king would ever notice. But his hands knew wet clay the way yours knows a familiar face. And every time he finished a piece, he did the same small thing. He lifted it up to the light, tapped the rim once with a fingertip, and listened. A good pot rings, a cracked one only thuds. That clear little sound was the only judge he ever trusted. When a pot rang true, he smiled, and he set it on the shelf, and that was enough for him. There was a child on his lane, a small girl, maybe 6, who liked to sit in his doorway and watch the wheel go around. When she got thirsty, he'd fill a plain cup with water, put it in her hands, and she'd drink the whole thing, hand it back, and tell him every single time that it was the best cup in the whole world. It wasn't. It was the plainest work. But when she said it, the pot rang and the water was cold. The man was happy, and none of it had been weighed by anyone. Some mornings she'd point to a shape still spinning on the wheel and ask him, "What is that going to be?" He'd tell her he didn't know yet, that the clay hadn't decided. She thought it was the funniest thing she'd ever heard, and it was true that he made better pots on the mornings that she came. In the center of the town stood a scale, an old iron balance worn smooth, taller than a child. Nobody remembered who'd built it. It wasn't magic. It never moved on its own. It simply weighed whatever the town laid upon it. Gold by the pinch, grain by the sack, a farmer's whole cart of apples. If you wanted to know what a thing was worth, you carried it to the square, set it on the scale, and watched the beam settle. Once each season, the town did something more. The makers brought out their finest work. The weaver, the smith, the potter, set them on the great scale one piece against another, while the whole town gathered to watch the beam decide that year who had made the best. The winner's name got spoken all year long. It was only ever meant to be a bit of fun, but a town that weighs everything will, in time, begin to weigh its people too. And nobody ever quite notices the day that it starts. You could see it, if you knew to look. A marriage was judged by the weight of what each family carried to it. A man's standing rose and fell with the fullness of his cart on market day. Children learned before they could read that the beam told the truth about a thing, and little by little, without anyone ever saying so, they came to believe it told the truth about them. For years the potter paid the way off no mind. Then, one market day, a traveler held one of his bowls up to the light and said, loud enough for the whole row of stalls to hear, "Now that is craftsmanship." Heads turned, people looked, and something in the potter's chest lit up, in a way the quiet ring of a cup never could. That season, for the first time, he carried his finest bowl to the weigh-off, and it won. They said his name all year, and he found that he could not live without hearing it said again. There was another potter, 2 towns over, whose work kept climbing towards his own. He had never once met the man. He didn't need to. He thought about him more than he thought about almost anyone he loved, measured every bowl he made against a pair of hands he had never seen, and lay awake over a competition that hadn't even happened yet. So he began making his pieces for the scale, heavier ones, grander ones, the kind that tip a beam and turn a crowd. He stopped tapping the rims, while strained for a sound only he could hear, when the whole square would tell him what a piece was worth. The plain cups, the ones people actually drank from, he made fewer and fewer of. There was no prize in a cup. The little girl still came to his doorway, but he was now busy, always chasing the next season, and her visits grew shorter. And then one day he looked up and couldn't remember when she'd stopped. Winning, it turned out, was not a place you arrived at. It was a thing you had to keep doing. There was always another maker rising, always the man 2 towns over gaining on him. And a worth measured against other people can always, any season, be lost. So he could never rest. He woke only bracing for the next way off, and laying down at night, having spent the whole day on it. Somewhere in all of it, The pain and joy of making an honest cup grew so quiet that he forgot it ever made a sound. His shelves filled up with showpieces too fine and too costly for anyone to actually eat from, and emptied of the plain cups that people had once reached for every day. He was admired in three valleys now, and he was tired in a way that sleep no longer reached. Then came the season of his masterwork. He'd never made anything like it. A great glazed bowl, months in the shaping, the finest thing his hands had ever touched. On the day of the weigh-off, he carried it to the square himself and set it on the scale against every other maker in the valley. The beam swung, it slowed, and it settled on his side. The square erupted. They lifted his name up over their heads, and they called him the finest potter the valley had ever known. It was everything he had chased for all of those years. And he stood there, in the middle of all of that noise, holding his prize and waited to feel it. The fullness. The enough. He waited for a beam that had just tipped in his favor to finally tell him the thing he'd been asking it for all of this time. It didn't. It was a scale. It had weighed his clay, and only ever his clay. The cheering reached him the way a sound reaches you through a wall, and he understood, standing there, that he'd spent so long listening for applause that he had forgotten the sound of truth. He searched the crowd for one face, a small one, from his lane, that used to believe the plainest cup in his store was the best in the world. She wasn't there. She hadn't been there in a very long time. That evening, he was closing his stall in the emptying square when a girl came up to him, older now, the child from his lane. Though it had been long ago, he almost didn't know her. She had a coin in her hand too small to buy anything at all. She was only thirsty. His hand went first, out of a long habit, to one of the finest bowls, the admired kind, the kind the square had weighed and praised over 100 times. He had it and lifted it from the shelf when he stopped and reached past it instead, took down a plain clay cup, one he'd made on some ordinary morning and never once bothered to carry on the scale. He filled it with water and set it in her two hands. She drank the whole thing, looked up at him and smiled. The potter stood there in the near dark, holding the empty cup, and then, without thinking, he lifted it up and tapped the rim once, with a single fingertip. It rang clear and true, exactly as it always had. He kept his stall in that square for the rest of his life, and he still set each piece on the old scale to price to clay, but he never again asked it the other thing. He went back to making cups that people drank from, and whenever a child came by thirsty, there was always one within reach, full and cold, and he never once wondered what it weighed. So let me leave you where the potter left himself. Whose name have you been straining to hear all year? Whose work have you set beside your own, on some scale in your head just to see which way the beam would tip? And if the whole square went silent tomorrow, no crowd, no beam, no one ahead of you and no one behind, what would you make? And who would you make it for? The world can weigh your work. It can never truly weigh your worth. If ancient wisdom without fluff speaks to you, like and subscribe. There are more stories waiting for you. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, share this with them.